Rome's military revolution, from defeat to dominance. The morning sun cast long shadows across the blood-red fields of Cannae as 80,000 Roman legionaries steeled themselves for battle. It was August 2nd, 216 BCE, and Rome was about to suffer the most catastrophic defeat in its history. Yet from this moment of supreme crisis would emerge a revolution in military thinking so profound that its echoes still resonate in war rooms and military academies today. The strategies born in Rome's darkest hours would transform warfare forever, crafted by commanders who understood that victory lay not just in the strength of an army's sword arm, but in the brilliance of its general's mind. In the 5 extraordinary campaigns that follow, we'll witness how a civilization under existential threat reinvented the art of war. From Scipio Africanus's audacious strike at New Carthage to Caesar's engineering marvel at Alesia, from Fabius's masterclass in strategic patience to Agrippa's revolutionary naval tactics at Actium, these were the moments when Roman generals dared to think differently. Their innovations would build an empire that spanned 3 continents and establish principles of strategy so fundamental that modern commanders from Napoleon to Patton would study them 2,000 years later. This is the story of how Rome's greatest minds transformed defeat into destiny, and in doing so, wrote the blueprint for 2 millennia of military victory. Scipio's revolutionary strategy at New Carthage. The Roman Senate chamber fell silent as Publius Cornelius Scipio, barely 24 years old, proposed what seemed like military suicide. In the depths of Rome's struggle against Hannibal, with Italy itself under invasion, this ambitious young commander suggested the unthinkable: abandon the defense of the homeland and strike directly at the heart of Carthaginian power in Spain. The seasoned senators exchanged worried glances. They were about to witness either the birth of a genius or the death of Rome's last hope. What the skeptical senators didn't know was that young Scipio had spent months interrogating fishermen, merchants, and sailors about a peculiar phenomenon at New Carthage, the enemy's seemingly impregnable Spanish capital. Every afternoon, as the Mediterranean sun reached its zenith, the water in the lagoon protecting the city's western flank dropped dramatically, creating a hidden pathway through the defensive marsh. It was the kind of detail that most generals would overlook, but Scipio wasn't most generals. On a spring morning in 209 BCE, the Carthaginian defenders of New Carthage woke to find 27,000 Roman legionaries outside their walls. Mago, the city's commander and Hannibal's younger brother, smiled. His walls were unbreachable, his garrison strong, and his food supplies ample. He could hold out for months while Carthaginian armies converged to crush the Romans. But Scipio had timed his assault perfectly. Not for the conventional dawn attack that military wisdom demanded, but for the exact moment when the afternoon tide would reach its lowest ebb. As the main Roman force launched a ferocious frontal assault that drew the defenders to the landward walls, Scipio led a hand-picked force of 500 men carrying scaling ladders through the now shallow lagoon. The few Carthaginian sentries who noticed them laughed. Surely these Romans didn't think they could wade through a sea marsh. But Scipio had studied the tide so carefully that he could tell his men exactly where to find the hidden sandbar path. By the time Mago realized what was happening, Roman eagles were already flying from his western towers. The fall of New Carthage sent shockwaves through the ancient world. In a single day, Scipio had captured the main Carthaginian arsenal, treasury, and shipyard in Spain, along with all their hostages from local tribes. But the true revolution wasn't just the victory, it was how it had been achieved. Scipio had introduced an entirely new dimension to warfare, the exploitation of natural phenomena through scientific observation. He had turned the very tides into a weapon. The young commander's triumph would reshape military thinking forever. Future generals would study not just tactics and terrain, but astronomy, meteorology, and oceanography. Scipio showed that the greatest victories come not from overwhelming force, but from understanding the subtle patterns that others overlook. As he stood on the captured walls of New Carthage, watching his men secure the city that would become Rome's Spanish capital, Scipio had done more than win a battle. He had invented a new way of thinking about war itself. Caesar's double wall, engineering an empire. The scouts galloped into Caesar's camp at midnight, their horses lathered with sweat. Vercingetorix's army had retreated to the hilltop fortress of Alesia, along with 80,000 Gallic warriors. In the command tent, Caesar unrolled a map by lamplight and smiled. His enemies had just made their fatal mistake. They had let themselves be trapped. But as he began sketching his plan on the dirt floor, his senior officers stared in disbelief. Caesar wasn't just proposing to besiege the largest fortress in Gaul. He intended to build a wall around it, and then build another wall around that wall. What followed was perhaps the greatest feat of military engineering in ancient history. 10 legions, 40,000 men began construction on a ring of fortifications 11 miles in circumference. They built 8 camps, 23 redoubts, and a complex system of trenches filled with sharpened stakes. But Caesar knew this wasn't enough. His spies reported that a massive Gallic relief army, 250,000 strong, was gathering to attack from the outside. In response, he ordered the construction of a second wall, 14 miles long, facing outward. His men were building themselves into a cage between 2 enormous armies. The scale of construction defied imagination. Caesar's men felled entire forests, drained marshes, and redirected streams. They dug a 20-foot wide trench filled with water from a diverted river. Behind it rose a 12-foot rampart topped with sharpened logs and towers every 80 feet. In front, they built 5 rows of carefully disguised traps, buried stakes called lilies because of the flower-like pattern they made, barbed stimuli hidden in shallow pits, and Scipii, logs bristling with iron hooks. When the Gallic relief army arrived, they found themselves facing what appeared to be a fully fortified Roman city that had sprung up from nowhere. Their first assaults were massacred in the killing fields of hidden traps. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix watched helplessly as his people began to starve. He expelled the women and children to conserve food, forcing them into the no-man's land between the armies where they slowly perished, a psychological warfare tactic that shattered Gallic morale. The final battle came during a moonless night. The relief army attacked from the west while Vercingetorix's forces surged from the fortress. For hours, the Romans fought desperately on 2 fronts, their 8-foot wide fighting platforms allowing rapid redeployment of reserves. The turning point came when Caesar personally led a cavalry charge that caught the Gauls in a devastating crossfire between his inner and outer walls. By dawn, the field was littered with 50,000 Gallic dead. Caesar's double wall at Alesia didn't just win a battle, it broke the spirit of Gallic resistance forever. His masterpiece of military engineering demonstrated that Roman technical superiority could overcome any odds. More subtly, it showed that the psychological impact of overwhelming technological advantage could be as decisive as the advantage itself. The sight of an 11-mile fortress materializing around them convinced the Gauls that they faced a power beyond their comprehension. In creating his impossible wall, Caesar had built more than a siege work. He had constructed a monument to Roman invincibility that would echo through history. The Fabian strategy, mastering the art of patience in warfare. Quintus Fabius Maximus could hear the mob howling for his blood outside the Senate chamber. They had labeled him the Delayer, intending it as an insult. Rome was burning. Hannibal's armies were ravaging the Italian countryside, and their chosen dictator refused to fight. As Fabius rose to address the Senate, he carried the weight of a radical idea: that in warfare, patience could be deadlier than the sword. The conventional wisdom of ancient warfare was simple. Two armies met on an open field, fought until one broke, and the victor claimed the spoils. But Fabius looked at Hannibal's superior cavalry, his veteran infantry, and his brilliant tactical mind, and saw that conventional wisdom was a path to destruction. Instead, he launched a campaign of shadows and whispers. His armies followed Hannibal's forces at a distance, staying to the high ground, refusing pitched battle. They struck at foraging parties, ambushed isolated units, and melted away before Hannibal could respond. Each night, the Carthaginian general would see Roman campfires on the surrounding hills, watching, waiting, wearing down his army's spirit. Hannibal tried everything to force a battle. He burned estates, destroyed crops, and slaughtered livestock. The great general who had crossed the Alps with elephants found himself powerless against an enemy who simply refused to lose. His African and Spanish troops, far from their homes, began to desert. Supply lines stretched thin. The mighty army that had seemed unstoppable began to starve in the midst of the richest peninsula in the Mediterranean. The genius of Fabius lay in his understanding of asymmetric warfare. Hannibal needed to win battles to maintain his coalition of allies and keep his army fed. Fabius only needed to ensure that Hannibal lost the war. Every day without a battle was a Roman victory. Every mile marched without combat drained Carthaginian supplies. Every season that passed weakened Hannibal's diplomatic position. Time itself became Fabius's most potent weapon. The culmination of the Fabian strategy came not in a glorious battle, but in a slow, inexorable drawing of the noose. Hannibal found himself trapped in southern Italy, his allies dwindling, his supplies exhausted, his unstoppable army reduced to foraging for survival. The mighty commander who had inflicted Rome's greatest defeats was undone not by force of arms, but by the relentless patience of an old man who understood that sometimes the boldest action is no action at all. Fabius's vindication would come long after his death. George Washington would study his tactics during the American Revolution. Mao Zedong would adapt his principles to guerrilla warfare. Modern military theorists would recognize in his strategy the foundations of contemporary asymmetric conflict. The man they mocked as the delayer had invented a form of warfare that would outlive the empire he saved. Marcus Agrippa's naval revolution at Actium. Marcus Agrippa stood at the prow of his flagship, studying the horizon where Mark Antony's fleet lay anchored off the coast of Actium. Behind him, the revolutionary Liburnian ships of his fleet cut through the waves, lighter, faster, and more maneuverable than any warships the Mediterranean had ever seen. In their design lay the culmination of years of naval experimentation that would transform maritime warfare forever. The traditional queens of ancient naval combat were the quinqueremes, massive galleys powered by hundreds of rowers designed to ram enemy vessels and deploy marines for boarding actions. But Agrippa had observed a fatal flaw. These ships were devastatingly effective in calm seas, but became ungainly weapons in choppy waters. His response was the harpax, a ballista-launched grappling hook that could snag enemy ships at twice the conventional range, combined with lighter ships that could maintain combat effectiveness even in adverse conditions. On the morning of September 2nd, 31 BCE, Antony's fleet emerged from the Gulf of Actium, led by the flagship of Cleopatra herself. The massive Egyptian vessels, their decks packed with marines and their holds laden with treasure, moved ponderously through the strengthening wind. Agrippa had spent months studying weather patterns in the Gulf, waiting for precisely these conditions. As the wind rose and the seas grew choppy, Antony's giant ships began to wallow. The battle opened not with a charge, but with an elegant dance of position. Agrippa's lighter ships darted around the flanks of Antony's formation, forcing them to turn and maintain cohesion in increasingly difficult seas. Each turn stressed the rowers of the larger ships. Each wave made their movements more labored. When Agrippa finally gave the order to attack, his ships struck like wolves against tired bulls. The harpax proved devastating. Fired from rotating ballistas on reinforced deck mounts, the iron-headed weapons caught Antony's ships at ranges that made counterfire impossible. Once snagged, the Egyptian vessels found themselves being pulled off balance by ships too light to drag them, but too nimble to shake loose. Antony's marines, packed densely on their rolling decks, couldn't maintain formation long enough to repel boarders. The decisive moment came when Cleopatra's flagship broke for the open sea, followed by Antony himself. Agrippa's revolution had shattered not just a fleet, but the foundation of ancient naval combat itself. His triumph at Actium established principles of naval warfare that would endure for centuries: the superiority of mobility over mass, the importance of weather and sea conditions, and the revolutionary concept that ships themselves, rather than the marines they carried, could be the primary weapons of naval combat. In the smoke-filled aftermath of Actium, as his men secured captured Egyptian vessels worth fortunes in gold, Agrippa had achieved something far more valuable. He had transformed naval warfare from a land battle fought at sea into a true battle of ships, a revolution that would influence naval design and tactics until the age of steam. The age of sail had begun in the wake of his Liburnian galleys. Trajan's Dacian gamble, engineering the impossible. In the pre-dawn darkness of 105 CE, Emperor Trajan stood at the northern bank of the Danube River, watching his engineers assemble what critics had deemed impossible: a bridge spanning one of the mightiest rivers in Europe. The massive stone pylons rose from the rushing waters like the spears of giants, a testament to Roman engineering that would stand for nearly 2 millennia. But this bridge was more than a marvel of architecture. It was the linchpin of the most audacious military campaign in Roman history. Across the river lay Dacia, a wealthy kingdom whose gold mines and fierce warriors had long tormented Rome's frontier. Previous emperors had been content to pay tribute and maintain an uneasy peace. But Trajan understood that the bridge would do more than carry his legions. It would shatter the Dacians' fundamental strategic assumption that the Danube would always protect them from Rome's full might. The scale of Trajan's logistical operation defied comprehension. While the bridge took shape, his engineers carved a road out of the sheer cliffs along the Danube Gorge, mounting wooden scaffolding that hung over 100-foot drops. Supply bases sprouted along the route like iron flowers, each one a fortress in itself. The message was clear: Rome wasn't coming to raid or punish, Rome was coming to stay. King Decebalus of Dacia watched these preparations with growing horror. The psychological impact of the bridge's construction was devastating. Every stone placed, every pylon raised, eroded his people's confidence in their natural defenses. By the time Trajan's legions began crossing in earnest, the Dacian alliance was already fracturing. Several tribal leaders, awed by this display of Roman engineering might, switched sides before a single battle was fought. The campaign itself was a masterpiece of combined arms warfare. Trajan used his superior logistics to deploy forces on a scale Dacia had never faced. Roman legions struck simultaneously from multiple directions, supported by auxiliary cavalry and guided by engineers who seemed to make mountains passable at will. When the Dacians retreated to their mountain strongholds, they found Roman siege engines already in place, transported piece by piece through valleys their defenders had thought impassable. What followed was more than a conquest, it was a systematic dismantling of a kingdom. Each Dacian fortress fell to precisely coordinated assaults. Each defensive line was outflanked by roads that appeared overnight. The psychological breaking point came when Roman troops emerged from a tunnel beneath the floors of Sarmis Aegetusa Regia, the Dacian capital itself. Decebalus, the proud king who had once defied Rome, took his own life rather than surrender to a power that could reshape the very earth to its will. Trajan's Dacian campaign revolutionized military thinking about the relationship between engineering and conquest. He proved that properly applied technology could negate any natural defense, that logistics could be a weapon more powerful than any legion. Most importantly, he demonstrated that the appearance of irresistible power, properly staged, could shatter an enemy's will to resist before the main battles even began. The bridge would stand for nearly 2 millennia after Trajan's death, its pylons finally demolished by time rather than human hands. But its true legacy lived on in every military commander who understood that the path to victory lay not just in the strength of armies, but in the power to reshape the very battlefield itself. The timeless legacy of Roman military genius. On a crisp autumn morning in 1944, General George Patton stood before a group of Allied commanders, explaining how he would break through the German lines in France. In his hand, he held a battered copy of Caesar's Commentaries. The generals watching might have been surprised to see one of history's great tank commanders citing a 2,000-year-old text, but Patton understood something fundamental. The principles of strategic genius are timeless. Modern warfare would have appeared as alien to Roman commanders as their legions would seem to us. Satellites circle the skies where augurs once watched for birds. Missiles have replaced the ballista. Aircraft carriers dwarf Agrippa's proudest ships. Yet in the command centers of the world's great powers, the echoes of Roman innovation still resonate. When the US military deploys overwhelming technological superiority to break enemy morale, they follow Trajan's footsteps. When guerrilla forces employ strategic delay against superior forces, they channel Fabius. When naval architects debate the trade-offs between firepower and mobility, they grapple with questions Agrippa answered at Actium. But perhaps the greatest legacy of Rome's military innovators lies not in specific tactics or strategies, but in their revolutionary way of thinking. They showed that true strategic genius lies not in following established doctrine, but in seeing possibilities others miss. Scipio saw a pathway through a lagoon where others saw an impregnable wall. Caesar envisioned a fortress where others saw an empty plain. Agrippa discovered the future of naval warfare in the design of a humble pirate ship. As warfare enters the digital age, with autonomous weapons and cyber attacks reshaping the battlefield in ways even Trajan's engineers could never have imagined, the fundamental insights of these Roman commanders become more relevant, not less. Their legacy teaches us that victory belongs not to those with the strongest weapons, but to those with the boldest minds. In the end, that may be their most enduring contribution to the art of war, the understanding that the greatest battles are won first in the imagination, then in the field. The eagles no longer fly over Roman legions, but their shadow still falls across every battlefield where commanders dare to think beyond the conventional, to see possibility where others see only obstacles. In that shadow stands the greatest lesson of Rome's military genius, that the future belongs to those who dare to reinvent the art of war itself.